Welcome to the Hoopsnake War Room, where strategy and tactics win the day. Here, we analyse different game mechanics, their histories, and their uses. Today, on this day, we're going to talk about turn-based gameplay. Like true gentlemen, we take it in turns to attack our opponents, then lie down and dutifully await their retribution. Advance! Turn-based gameplay is a game system where a player takes a limited number of moves or actions comprising a single turn and then passes over to another player or computer. The player must then wait until their next turn before they can act again. This gives players the chance to adapt and react to moves made by their opponent, while also furthering their own master plan, without fear of wasting precious time, as their opponent cannot move until their turn is complete. Thank you. As just demonstrated, Toby took his turn, using it to deliver a big ol' slap to my face. I waited patiently for him to end his turn before taking my action, a cheeky retaliating smack. This game is for illustration purposes only, please don't do this at home. There are some turn-based games, usually video games rather than board games, where players' turns all happen simultaneously rather than consecutively. These games still shelter in the turn-based bunker, as the game kindly waits for all the players to finish their turns before advancing. Having a computer making sure that all the players are adhering to the same rules makes this a lot more practical than in, say, a board game. This methodical tit-for-tat gives a deliciously sumptuous layer of strategy. You get to plan as many turns ahead as you can while still being able to change tack and counter your opponent's plotting and scheming. Taking turns is very, very common across board games, but mostly as a convenience rather than a specific design decision. It'd be really difficult to play, any board game I can think of in real time and have it still be fun. Let's check. In video games, however, you have the advantage of having a digital computer pal who can do lots of the number crunching and calculating for you, so having players taking turns becomes a lot more of a choice that generally lends itself to strategic games, often centering around conflict and discovery. A lot of 4X games use turns, that's explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate, like Civilization, a long-running franchise that continues to be at the forefront of strategic gameplay. The famous Sid Meier's quote, "A game is a series of interesting decisions," highlights where the focus of the evolution of the franchise is, and also shows just how perfect turn-based mechanics are for him, giving each player plenty of time to make the interesting decisions presented. What's the history of turn-based mechanics? Turn-based gameplay has been a part of games for longer than there have been games. Let that sink in for a second. Some of the earliest board games discovered by archaeologists and historians are believed to be turn-based. And so are some of the earliest games that are recent enough to still have rules of play around today, like Go, over 2 centuries old, and Shatranj, the progenitor of chess from over 1,000 years ago. The idea of turn-based strategy made its way through chess into some of the earliest wargames, like Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig's earliest wargame in 1780, and then into contemporary wargames, and from there into video games too. Early examples of turn-based strategy in video games date back as far as 1977 with Empire, and 1981 with Eastern Front 1941. It's since been an absolute staple of both board games and video games. Being turn-based immediately gives a game a very specific flavour right out of the bottle. It tells a potential player that they're going to have to think at least a little bit while playing the game, if not quite a lot. They might end up also having to think to a mind-melting amount. It also generally implies that gameplay choices are going to have long-term consequences, and to me at least, it suggests that the gameplay might be quite slow. But don't let slow masquerade as relaxing. You'll be strapped into a chair that gradually inches forward, turn by turn, moving your eyes closer and closer to a pair of devilishly pointed spikes. And if that's your cup of tea, turn-based gameplay is wonderful. If you don't like that image, you may want to think twice before sitting in the mysterious chair. With the peril comes a potential for getting better at a game, slowly mastering its systems and overcoming its challenges. And if Dark Souls taught us anything, it's that pain feels good and mastery feels even better.
Turn-based mechanics are typically used in games to allow and facilitate interaction. You do something, your opponent does something in response, and so on. Some games that are typically played in turns don't actually need to be. Snakes and Ladders, or Chutes and Ladders, among the worst games ever, can actually be played in real time. Players keep track of how many dice rolls they've made for them to get to the end. And then, once the game's over, you just compare how many dice rolls were taken. Whoever rolled the least wins. However, when you look at chess, in no way could you take the same approach. It branches off in moves and counter moves, with each move a response to the moves that have created the board state thus far. The same is true for most turn-based games, you'd know. Even games where the interaction is more indirect, such as getting to locations first or acquiring resources. But this raises an important question. Who gets to go first? And what does that mean? In many games, who goes first is essentially irrelevant. The number of turns and crucially what you can do on your turn limits the first turn advantage. If what you can do on a single turn is limited, when multiple turns are required to build up to something, first turn advantage is limited. The game is decided at a much later point. Take Dominion, which we talked about last episode. What you do in your turn is strictly limited, particularly your first turn. At most, you can buy one card. Nothing you do will prevent your opponents from doing what they want to do on their first turn. A game like Warhammer 40k can have a massive first turn advantage. If you go first, your entire army can move, seize advantageous positions, and fire. This has led to the phenomenon of alpha strikes, where you just blast away your opponent's army and win on the first turn. Various editions of the game have taken different approaches to solving this. The most common approach is to make sure that players don't know who's going first when they deploy their armies. Both players instinctively hide their units to avoid the risk of being utterly destroyed if their opponent goes first. Other editions have taken a more unconventional approach, such as adding night fighting rules, so during the first turn a quasi-fog of war descends, limiting the effectiveness of long-range fire. Tournament data suggests that the current edition does a relatively good job of balancing first and second turn, but I still have a strong preference for going first. Chess is extremely interesting when it comes to first turn advantage, because we don't actually know if it has one. Chess is not solved. We don't know who wins, white or black, if both sides play perfectly. The instinct is that white has the advantage, and certainly at high levels there are certain routes of play from black that always result in a loss. But doesn't what I said earlier about limited things to do in a turn apply to chess? You can only move one piece. A chess turn has one crucial difference, and that is that every move is a direct response. White, in going first, gets to set the direction of play. It gets the initiative, and that might be the crucial advantage.
Turn-based gameplay can, and often does, slow the pace of a game way down. Players who are still learning a game's systems or suffer from analysis paralysis, I'm looking at Toby mostly here, can end up feeling like each turn is taking an eternity, which can spread the consequences of your choices far too thinly to be enjoyable for some players. Without seeing the outcomes of your decisions, the turns where you're making those decisions can feel far less meaningful. My favourite game that uses turn-based gameplay is Diplomacy, specifically Web Diplomacy, the online version. The game starts out looking like a simplified version of Risk, with each player taking control of a specific country and its armies. The aim is to expand your territory with every city you hold, giving you an extra army to work with until eventually someone controls the majority of the map. This is all pretty standard wargame fodder until you realise that it's basically impossible to hold the majority of the map on your own. You'll need other players for that. You'll need to make alliances, and to do that you'll have to trust at least a few of your fellow players, at least a little bit. The extra beauty of playing this game online is having anonymous conversations with your fellow players. Nobody knows who's playing each country, so it's very hard to let external personal biases impact your decisions. Italy could be that one friend who always lies in games for personal gain, but they could also be that one friend who's super naive and doesn't really know the game that well. A perfect target for early game manipulation and then late game betrayal. If that didn't give it away, I'm the friend that always lies in games for personal gain.
Every time.
The final super special sauce here is the turn. We played with turns that lasted 48 hours, which means that everyone in that time period gets a chance to create plans, discuss them with their neighbours, exchange promises, form alliances, betray one another, change their plans, re-strategize, and eventually stab each other in the back. It gives everyone a real chance to dig into the core of the game, the diplomacy. The game encourages you to take an interest in politics, making your own little board game version of the world a tiny microcosm for the political turmoil in the real world. It tickles the player's interest in history and warfare and inter-country decision-making. Also, and this is the last thing I'll say about diplomacy, I promise we'll move on soon, having 48-hour turns enables players to get involved when they wouldn't normally want to commit to sitting down for an 8-hour game in one sitting. It's only a small ask of maybe 10 minutes across the 2 days. It's tiny, It's easy for people to get involved in the game when it requires such a small time investment each day.
My favourite turn-based game is Star Wars X-Wing. X-Wing is interesting because it solves, or attempts to solve, the first turn advantage problem by having an initiative-based turn system. Some pilots have higher initiative than others. They move last and shoot first. You pay for that advantage when you pick your sides. So in theory, you're sacrificing something to gain that initiative. Not only does this turn structure quantify the first turn advantage, it also creates this feeling of maneuver and counter-maneuver. If you can predict what your opponent's doing, where they're going to be, you are going to win. If you moved all your ships at once in a more conventional turn structure, a lot of that feeling would just disappear. X-Wing's not the only game to have an activation or initiative-based game structure. Warcry, which I talked about in an earlier episode, has a very similar structure, as do a lot of modern war games. In X-Wing, this turn structure is a key part of bringing that feeling of dogfighting. It's not just a way to limit first turn advantage. And because of that, I think in X-Wing, it's a game design masterstroke.
One of my favourite turn-based games is the tactical squad shooter, Frozen Synapse. You control a handful of soldiers with a variety of guns, and you face off against your opponent with a similar team in a top-down arena with walls, windows, and other sorts of cover. The action takes place in 5-second intervals of real time, but the decision-making process is turn-based between those bursts. Each turn, you plan your troops' movements, speed, aim direction and stance, and send through your instructions to the server. Your opponent plans their turn simultaneously, but their commands are hidden, meaning only once you've both committed do you see the real outcome on the field. Your units do exactly what you told them, and the result of any firefight is deterministic, making decisions about speed, stance, and weapon type vital to your hopes of winning. This is a highly tactical game, made even more so by my favourite feature, simulations. Before you commit to your turn, you can make guesses about what your opponent is going to do and see how your troops will react to those situations. You can use this to tweak your commands, trying to ensure that regardless of whether they come around the left or the right corner, you'll be able to get a shot off at them first. This lends itself to players who like to take their time, so much so that you can play the game via email, like a newfangled version of chess by post. At the end of the game, you can watch a replay of what happened. What ends up being less than a minute of real-time action is made far more strategic and deliberate by the introduction of turn-based mechanics.
An interesting, slightly more abstract use of turn-based gameplay takes place in the modern Fallout games. You play as a lone warrior, a courier, or a sole survivor making your way through a post-apocalyptic world. I want to talk about these games in more detail, but that's another video in another series. The important thing here is this: you interact with the world primarily as a first or third person shooter, but each protagonist has a special computer called a Pip-Boy that allows them to freeze or slow time right down, and target specific attacks to a dedicated spot on an enemy. That effectively adds turn-based gameplay into a real-time game. It's partly a design inherited from the early Fallout games, which were turn-based. It's integrated in a really unique way and gets you some really cool gameplay moments.
Jamming turn-based mechanics into real-time games is a favourite of mine, but to push it a step further, you could take inspiration from the classic classroom game where you draw a head on a piece of paper and fold it over, pass it to the next person. They draw a torso, fold over, etc, and you end up with some horrifying mess of a person. How about a co-op RTS game where you control the economy while your partner controls the military? Then every 30 seconds you switch places with your partner, being thrust into the middle of a battlefield. Voice communication is only allowed if you both stop pressing buttons for 3 seconds, making you watch helplessly as your situation gets out of control. Or how about a co-op tactical shooter that works in 30-second real-time segments, in which you can't communicate with any of your team. Between each segment, the game pauses, a shared whiteboard pops up, and voice chat is enabled for you to plan the next 30 seconds as a squad. Once you're ready, the game continues, and you try your best to execute the plan. This combines the excitement of real-time games with the tactical decision-making found in turn-based games.
So to round things off, turn-based mechanics are rampant in board games and have also evolved very naturally into video games. They allow designers to curate the amount of time a player has to make a decision, which gives the player space to think as strategically as they would like to. It's a really cool mechanic when you're going for a game that requires a lot of headspace or competitive strategy. Controlling the duration and frequency of turns can allow players to get involved with games that are either much more complicated or time-consuming than they normally would. And it can even be used as a special case in real-time games to make a particular moment more interesting or exciting.
Thanks for watching this episode of Taking Turns at It, working title. If you had a good time or learned something, give us a like and go subscribe to our channel for more. If you're interested in what we're developing, go check out our website, link in the tray. Next month, we'll be talking about social deduction games, so be sure to tune in then. The microphone is nowhere near my nipples.
Well, who's to say, Matt? I don't know where your nipples are.
Nips are here, Mics are there. Very different.
Thank you. I've got that on camera.
Ah.